Oh, so it's a real pleasure to have you here, and it's such a happy occasion. And today, my day has been bookended with two happy occasions. The first was walking around the E3 Learning Foundry with its glass on. It's now got a proper face, so it's got character. And then the end of today is introducing Jane and her inaugural lecture. So, and I also reckon that all the rare orchids and ancient trees and young shoots across the entirety of the campus would all descend today in the lecture theatre to hear Jane. And the other thing that I reckoned is that the room would have a real buzz. And it absolutely does. And if my children were here, they would be groaning at the terrible joke. But Jane is that kind of person. Jane is buzzing. Jane is enthusiastic. She's always got a smile on her face. And Jane is somebody which the rest of us kind of feel happy to follow wherever she's going to take us. And that can be anywhere from investigating invasive weeds, and I sometimes think of myself as one of those, all the way through to pollinators, through to geography, landscapes, agriculture, policy, the way in which we lose our land, the way in which we think about our natural capital, all of those things kind of all come together and are personified in Jane. So I just wanted to run a little bit past you some of the things that I noticed about Jane in her CV. So Jane was educated in the UK, so she did GCSEs and A-levels, and she did very well in them, of course. And then she went to the University of Southampton, where she did her primary degree and her PhD. And then about sort of 2001, she got pulled over to Trinity. And in Trinity, she started as a postdoc, and then she did a teaching fellow. She was broad curriculum teaching lecturer. And she did a postdoc on invasive weeds with John Parnell, and John Parnell is really a feature of the School of Botany. And so she became a lecturer in botany in 2011, 2014, and then she never looked back. And it's just been step by step by step change from bringing in smaller research grants to bigger research grants to developing policy. So she's been funded by the EPA, by SFI, MARI, by Horizon Europe, where she developed a global database on crop pollination. I mean, a global database, it's just phenomenal. She's co-PI for an SFI research center called BioOrbic Phase 2. She's graduated 21 PhD students, 3 MSc students, and 24 postdocs, and I'm sure many of them are in the audience. Her look through her movement from the way in which humans interact with the planet is really kind of through the lens of the way in which pollination, the way in which our insects interact with our planet and have become so essential. And now we all understand the ecosystem. And there is nowhere in Ireland where you don't hop in the car or walk along or on the bus and you see one of these pollinator plaques that says left for wildlife and pollination. And that really, I believe, all stems from Jane and Jane's contribution. So Jane, co-leader of Nature Plus, probably president now rather than president-elect of the Royal Entomologist Society, founder and steering group deputy chair, witness for policy application, All Ireland Pollinator Plan, and just altogether a most inspirational lady. And today we celebrate her achievement in getting to the highest possible accolade in academic life. Yeah, good day.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. Is the microphone working? Can you hear me down the back? Thank you for that welcome, Sylvia. Thank you to everyone who's here, Provost, colleagues, friends, thanks for coming. And thank you very much to Katie and Hanju from the Faculty Office for organising tonight and making sure there's wine out there so when you can have a drink. I don't think when I started in Trinity in 2001, that 23 years later I would still be here, but also that I'd be here doing this I think being here in Trinity has given me really unexpected opportunities. I think it's given me opportunities that I wouldn't necessarily have had anywhere else. And I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful for the teams that I work with, both in my current day job in front of college and my home back in botany and School of Natural Sciences. And what I've tried to do with the talk this evening is reflect what I've done in the time that I've been here in Trinity. And the title comes from this idea of change, the idea that we're surrounded by obviously deep environmental change, and that's what I was recruited to do when I first came to Trinity, was to develop a course in environmental change. But also that my research has changed a lot, from being an ecologist looking at the intricacies of pollinator interactions to working with policy, working with practice, as Sylvia's described. And it certainly feels like I'm besieged quite a lot of the time. There's a huge amount of change happening, and sometimes it feels like we're inundated with problems that we just have to take direction. So that's sort of where I'm coming from with the talk. The other title to my talk could have been "It's Not All About Bees." I know I'm known as the bee lady or that mad bee lady throughout Trinity, but I don't work exclusively on bees. And I'll go beyond bees in the talk this evening, but heads up, I spent most of the last 30 years working on bees. I think they're amazing, so I am going to talk about them quite a lot. For those of you who haven't heard me speak before, I'm not talking about the kind of bees that die horribly with their backsides ripped out when they sting you. We're not talking about the ones that are being minded by beekeepers. Ones that are pictured here. Winnie the Pooh decided for the wrong sort of bees. One of the very first A.A. Milne books, Winnie the Pooh, when he tries to take honey from the bees, and they're fairly upset about it, so he concludes that these are the wrong sort of bees. For me, they're the right sort of bees. They do actually make honey. You just need to be a little bit more honey. These bees, these bumblebees, they don't make commercially extractable honey, but they also don't die when they sting you. They can sting you several times and still survive. They're not minded by beekeepers, and in fact, until quite recently, they really weren't minded by anyone at all. And here I have to give credit to my PhD supervisor, Dave Wilson, who founded the Bumblebee Conservation Trust in the UK and wrote several pop science books on bumblebees, first one in the tail. And it was through Dave's work and the work of Dave's colleagues that the profile of bumblebees has really been raised amongst the public and in policy. And here we can see the picture here is from Dave and two of my PhD lab mates. And these are the people who really got me interested in insects and in bees in particular. Dave was much, much younger and probably should have been wearing more than just a sheet at a party. But these guys really inspired me, because even though I grew up in the countryside, surrounded by nature in the Midlands of England, here's the some of my progress. But I grew up in the countryside, surrounded by nature. My parents were keen gardeners. My dad knew all the birds. My mum knew all the names of all the wildflowers. And I've been vaguely aware of buzzy flying stuff and scuffy things on the ground, but I never really thought about them. I never really looked at them closely. And so I'd never really thought about how bees choose which flowers to feed on, how their body size and their tongue length restricts which flowers they're able to extract nectar from. I never thought how they interacted with other creatures that fed on flowers, or how their movements on the flowers and their perfectly fluffy little bodies were really so well adapted for transferring pollen between flowers. All of these things have passed me by, but all of these things became the subject of my PhD. So my PhD investigated how what influenced bees and their foraging behavior, and how that influenced plant pollination. And so on the day I submitted my thesis, I came up with the inspiring title of The Foraging Ecology of Bumblebees. Here's me in my graduation day. I couldn't find the hat, but I got the robe. And this was also my first brush with the media. And actually, I was advertising in the local newspaper to try and get bumblebee colonies to do some work. And I was asking people if they had a nest in their garden. Very naively, I was going to go and pick it up and use it in my research. It was also my first media interactions in terms of the outputs of our research and what people were interested in. So we were working on scent marks and bees, and the fact that they use scent marks to communicate and improve their foraging efficiency. It was like this I think it's actually the Daily Mail or the Daily Express or something, but "Work is a breeze for smelly-footed bees" was always a much better title than the title I actually put on my academic papers. And remember, all of this was back before bees were cool. This was 1996, I started my PhD. Everybody thought we were a bit odd. I suppose we might have been really, but it turns out that these insects that I hadn't really paid any attention to before are endlessly fascinating. And not only are they fascinating in terms of their ecology and what they do, but they're also really, really important. They're important commercially, they're really important pollinators, they're important for pollinating various crops, including things like strawberries grown in glass houses in North Dublin, almonds and almond orchards. And because they're so important for commercial pollination, they've actually been and used commercially for pollination services. So because bumblebees are cute, they're fluffy, they're worth money, Dave and other people drew attention to the fact that they were in decline. They've really become the poster child for nature, for the value of nature to people, and for the protection and conservation of nature. But the bumblebees are only a small fraction of the story. There's about 20,000 species of bee worldwide. So just for reference, there's about 5,000 species of mammal on the planet. So 4 times as many bee species as mammal species. And the thing that the bees all have in common is that they all feed their larvae get their nutrition from pollen from plants. And this is what makes bees such good pollinators, because they need to visit plants in order to collect food for their offspring, but also food for themselves in terms of nectar, which is kind of like an energy drink. It's full of sugar, and that's what keeps them going and keeps them flying. So this is what distinguishes bees from wasps. So if anyone asks what's the difference between a bee and a wasp, it's very hard to tell if you just look at them. But if you know what they're eating, or more specifically what they're feeding their offspring, then that's the answer. So bees are basically, if they're evolved from wasps, they're basically vegetarian wasps that focus on pollen. But they're hugely, hugely diverse. So this is the world's biggest identified by Alfred Russel Wallace, and it occurs on just 3 islands in Indonesia. It's a resin bee. Its habitat, it has a weird lifestyle that involves living in arboreal termite nests. That means it lives in the nests of other insects that nest above ground, and it collects resin to build its nest. It's extremely rare. It was thought extinct until it was rediscovered in 1981. And then it was rediscovered more recently as well. And its habitats are threatened. So it nests in lowland forests in Indonesia, which are exactly the places that are being threatened from oil palm expansion. So that's the world's biggest tiny little species of stingless bees, the Trigona, which is around 500 species in the tropics and subtropics. And these actually are social bees, so they live in colonies, they produce honey, and they are they do act as pollinators, but because of their size, they're not necessarily used as pollinators commercially. And these bees, I'm trying to remember what I was going to say. I had to bring my notes because looking at all your faces completely frozen. Because bees are, I suppose actually the one thing I was going to say, that's what I was going to say about the melatonin area. And as soon as you make any generalization about anything in nature, you find an exception. So there's about 3 species of these Trigona from South America that are actually known as vulture bees. And they actually collect meat and they make honey-like substance from their and that's very protein-rich for their offspring. So that's one thing about ecology. But anyway, bees incredibly diverse globally. Some colonies, the ones that we're all familiar with, the honeybees, they make honey in order to have something to feed on during the lean times. So for honeybees, that means over the winter, so they survive over the winter. So they have a single reproducing queen, lots of non-reproducing female workers in the colony, and they help to rear their siblings. And then the males that don't really do very much at all, they just leave and mate. Actually, that's what they do. So that's the honeybees. Also colonial, but they have annual colony cycles. So they all die out at the end of the year. So we're all quite familiar with the social bees, but there's a huge range of lifestyles that the bees employ. So some of them are sector parasites, so they're cookies. So where these guys have set up their nests, come along, kill the queen, and they lay their own eggs in the nest. Their offspring are tended and reared by the workers of the bumblebee. A huge range of lifestyles. And actually in Ireland, we've got 100 species of bee, 1 species of honeybee, 21 species of bumblebee, and 80 species of solitary bee. And worldwide, most bees are solitary. So what we mean by solitary is that they rear their larvae in isolation, so they don't grow up in a colony. So the solitary bees that we have in Ireland, some of them nest in each of these little cells. And she sealed up the cell, and then she moved on to the next one, and then the next one, and then the next one. Here's the back end of one going into a cavity. They use the cells. In fact, most of our solitary bees don't nest in these cavities. The bottom here is from an experiment we did. This was Saturday afternoon in lockdown, spending hours putting lots of different sized tubes into pipes to do an experiment to see what kind of size tubes, because we didn't really know. Most bees, though, don't nest in cavities, they actually nest in the ground. Most of these are from Trinity years ago. So most of our bees nest in the ground. But I think what I have to say is it's not all about bees. In terms of pollinators, bees are only a fraction of our pollinating species. And range of organisms that act as pollinators worldwide. Basically, a pollinator is any animal that visits a flower and then moves to another one, and in doing that transfers pollen. So it's a really plant-centric definition of an animal and what an animal does. The most famous pollinators spend their whole life cycle connected with flowers, but a lot of flies and other insects are also important pollinators. It's just hard to get people excited about flies. When we look at actually who the pollinators are in Ireland, I've had obviously quite a few PhD students over the years, collecting data, and some of them are here in the room, collecting data in the field on different pollinators and different habitats. When we bring all this data together, we find that actually about 60% of flower visits are carried out by bees in Ireland, about 35% by flies, and only about 4% by butterflies. So bees are important, but other things are important too. I think some of these flies and they can fool, well, certainly they can fool entomologists, but they can also fool bees, bumblebees, and they get into their nests and they lay their eggs in their nests, and their larvae consume the detritus and sometimes the odd bee larva through their development process. And again, the data set analyzed how many hours and how many PhD students it took to build these networks up. What we find is that we see different interaction structures, so you can apply mathematical analysis to the structure of these interaction networks and use those parameters to compare between places, to compare between systems, and to look at the resilience and the structure of the networks. What we found in Ireland is that Irish networks differ from place to place, but also they're quite different to networks from other countries, and particularly from other island habitats, but different not in a good way. So in most other places, intensive systems, much fewer insect taxa and more plant taxa. And this actually makes these networks less resilient to change and more susceptible to perturbations. So the other thing that these networks allow us to do is to identify which plant species are being used by our native pollinators. So when we talk about pollinator conservation, and which, you know, the question we most frequently get is, okay, what plants should I plant, or which species should I encourage to encourage the insects? So this gives us the information on which species are actually the most important according to various different systems. So the plant pollinator interactions are complex systems, not just these, there's other taxa, and they vary from habitat type to habitat type. But also within a habitat type, so even just within farmland in Ireland, different species need different things, and so you get different associations. So this is from I think last week I've got fresh on my head. Different taxa are using different farmland features in different ways. And the reason that it's important to understand this is so that we can understand and design appropriate agri-environmental schemes. So if you think about policy and policymakers, they want something really simple. Okay, what works everywhere? And the point of this is that the same thing doesn't work everywhere for everything. So we need that diversity, we need that complexity in our landscape. So it makes it very difficult to design one-size-fits-all conservation measures. And in fact, in terms of our pollinating insects, their health, their abundance, their diversity, their well-being is influenced by multiple factors. So it's influenced by what's going on in the landscape, and whether there's places and resources for nesting. They're influenced by the availability of food and floral resources. They're influenced by the quality of those food and floral resources, both in terms of intrinsic quality and how they're affected by contaminants like pesticides. And they're also influenced by what all the other organisms in the environment are doing. So the competitors, the other insects that are visiting flowers, the pests, the diseases. And all of this is influenced by global change in terms of climate change. So in terms of predicting what might happen, in terms of understanding ecological systems, it's quite complex. And even closely related species can react very differently to availability of resources or the quantity and quality of food. So it means it becomes difficult to manage them. So for example, as Sylvia mentioned, I've spent quite a lot of time working on invasive plants, and this invasive plant in particular. So this is introduced rhododendron ponticum. When it's in flower, it's either you look at this and go, wow, isn't that pretty? Or you look at this and go, wow, look at all the food for the insects. Or if you're a plant ecologist, you look at this and think, oh my God, that habitat's ruined because of this invasive plant. And what we found with rhododendron ponticum was, even though it's got all these flowers produce quite a lot of nectar. I put this picture just to prove that once upon a time I did actually go into it. And we measured the amount of nectar and the sugar quality of the nectar, and it produces loads of nectar. It's fantastic. As a resource, the flowers are quite open, they're big, they're easy to access. This should be great for bees. But the nectar is defended, so the plant defends its tissues with toxins. And in the case of rhododendron, it's a grey and this is a toxin that can actually, even in people, can cause cardiovascular and circulatory problems. It's rarely fatal, but it can make people quite sick. So we looked at what impacts these granotoxins and these toxic nectars had on different species of bees. So three quite closely related species of bee: honeybees, bumblebees, solitary mining bees that I mentioned from the flat Trinity. And when honeybees are fed rhododendron nectar, they die straight away. They don't like it at all. Bumblebees can live on it for weeks. Terminate the experiment. Solitary bees. So they exhibited what we politely put in our paper, symptoms of malaise, which was they were basically lying on their backs, waving their legs in the air. And so it didn't kill them. So it wasn't about mortality and the effects of chemicals on whether things live or die. But in this case, it didn't kill them, but it did affect their behavior. It did affect their physiology. It did affect their ability to forage or fly or to raise their young. So I guess what this study, and we spent years studying rhododendron, it's a very potted history of an awful lot of research on rhododendron. What we sort of, I guess what this brought us to is, one, why do plants, load their nectar and pollen with toxins that kill off the things that they're trying to attract to pollinate them? And there's lots of explanations. And for rhododendron, we think one of the explanations is just to deter non-pollinating insects. Accessible flowers. If everything can come in and take the nectar, but doesn't actually stop pollinating, then it's a waste of resource from the plant's point of view. So what I did is found that the bigger insects were better at pollinating, and they happen to be the bumblebees. So that's probably why bumblebees can tolerate these toxins. So there's lots of explanations as to why there might be toxins in nectar. Another one might be antimicrobial functions. It might be to get the bees addicted so that they keep coming back. There's lots of plants that have toxins in their nectar or potential toxins. So alkaloids like nicotine in a lot of the nightshade family plants, caffeine, obviously, tea. And there's lots of reasons why they might be there, and lots of different impacts they can have on them. Reacting differently. And so then we started to think about, okay, so these are the natural things, the natural contaminants, the natural toxins that occur in plants. What about the synthetic things? What about the contaminants that arrive in plants through our activities? And there's been a huge amount of interest in the last decade or so in terms of policy, in terms of agriculture, in terms of research, in terms of the general public on what the impacts of pesticides are on pollinators. And I suppose the first thing to say is we shouldn't be too surprised that toxic chemicals that are designed to kill insects, even the ones that we don't want to kill. But what has become clear is that insects are exposed to a range of different chemicals, but we don't know exactly which ones. We don't know how, and we don't know how much, and we don't know what the impacts of those things are. So things like herbicides and fungicides, which aren't designed to kill insects, what impacts do they have? What impacts do they have on our pollinating insects? So our research over the last decade or so has helped to fill some of these knowledge gaps. So we look at, what kind of pesticides are actually used. And you think this would be something really easy to get data on. It's not. What we found was that we can get data on usage, but do we talk about the amount that's put on the ground? Or do we talk about the area covered? Talk about the number of times that those applications are made. And it turns out that each member state country in the EU who are required to report on these things reports it in a different way. So it's really hard to compare. So we've got extent of application in terms of hectares for Ireland. Is this a lot? Is it not a lot? We don't know. We don't know whether that's multiple applications in a year or just one application. So the data really are very, very so that's the first thing. And we know that the pesticides then turn up in the places where it wasn't intended for them to be. So the bees become exposed. We've had various studies, and they're heroic effort by a PhD student extracting a huge amount of nectar and pollen. Now remember that nectar, when I say huge amount, you're talking about less than a microliter of each flower. So poor Eleanor extracted, I think, 10,000 flowers or something, nectar from 10,000 flowers in order to get enough to run without nectar. And it turned out there was a whole range of different chemicals in the nectar of both the crop plants, which were target plants, and of the wild plants that grew alongside. So the insects are exposed to pesticides through nectar and pollen. And I suppose as an aside, this route also gets into nectar. So we did some tests on honey, Irish honey samples. Found 70% of honeys contained at least one neonicotinoid, so these are insecticide pesticides, not in levels to cause concern amongst people, with minimum residue levels, so they're not enough to actually make anyone sick, but they're there and they're detectable. And this exposure to these chemicals in the nectar and pollen affects the foraging behavior of insects, both when they're foraging in the field or a patch of flowers, but also in the lab when you actually dose them with specific amounts of different compounds in sugar solutions. And all of that then has a knock-on impact at the colony level. And this can affect the reproductive success of these. So this study here, and Jess is in the audience here, Jess is one of the lead co-authors, was part of a big project across Europe. She marks the coordination of that project. Collectively, through a project, deployed bumblebee nests across 100 different sites across Europe, left the bees there to forage, brought them back into the lab after a few weeks, measured the growth of the colony, the amount of reproductives they produced, but also the contamination of the colony in terms of the pesticides in the colony and the pollen that the bees brought back. And what we found is there's a huge range of pesticides that bees across the whole of Europe are being exposed to, and it's reduced reproductive success. So in terms of pesticides, one, they're being used, two, they're getting into the bees, three, they're not really good for them. I mean, that's, kind of seems obvious, how much money and how many people do we have to employ and how many hours in the field and the lab were necessary to gather this data. But it was important to do that. And one of the reasons is that the agrochemical industry, the lobbies, they're hugely influential at policy level, with farmers, with the general public. And so we need to collect this evidence. We need this data, and we need this data to be robust and published in good journals in order to counter the arguments that actually it's fine, pesticides are fine, we need pesticides. That's the mantra that's used. But in terms of doing things differently and in that spirit of change, we could farm without pesticides. We could do things differently. We could intensify ecologically. We could work with nature rather than against it, employ natural enemies that pass through our pollinators. But it's a very, very difficult sell at the policy level and at the social and I think for me, it shouldn't be a surprise. If we're throwing loads of toxic chemicals all over the countryside, this is going to have adverse effects on wildlife. But it's what do we do then? And pollinators have really become, like I say, the poster child of understanding the impacts of things like modern agriculture on nature, and they've become very much the focus of and one of those reasons is that insects and other pollinators are really important parts of our food system. So globally, about 87% of all plants, so most plant species worldwide, benefit from animal pollination. That includes about 3/4 of the world's food crops. That includes crops in Ireland like oilseed rape and a few other field crops, but also soft fruits and water crops like but it's in other parts of the world that are very heavily dependent agricultural economies where this link between the pollination, the seed production, the socioeconomic status of So I was really fortunate to do some work that goes across the sub-Saharan Sahel in Africa. And its oils are really important in terms of being a local source of oil for cooking and for all sorts of other things, rubbing the hair and the skin and everything. But it's a globally traded commodity. And the interesting thing about shea is that it is the women in the community who collect the fruits, who process the shea butter, and the proceeds from this industry goes into the women's economy, which is mostly the economy that feeds and clothes the children. So this link between nature, and we found that these things are insect pollinated, they're bee pollinated. When the habitats are more diverse and there's more other trees and shrubs in the habitat, you get a higher level of pollination. This link between what's happening in nature and what's happening in the communities becomes much more obvious. And we also did some work then looking at a kind of a higher level, this connection between economic impacts and biodiversity loss, and modeled the impacts of pollinator loss on a global scale, looking at losses and gains across the world, taking into account all sorts of complicated economic stuff like price elasticities and things I never really understood. But looking at pesticide risk areas, looking at natural disaster risk areas, and trying to model what the impacts of pollinator loss are. And this is where we start to see and to get these sort of high level indicators of the importance of nature, pollinators for our economy and society. And if we think about these connections between nature and people, this is a framework that we developed from the IPBES framework, the IPBES Governmental Science Policy Platform for Biodiversity Services. And this is kind of the biodiversity and nature of the IPCC, it's the global reporting. Anyway, they come up with a framework to link to, as humans, the drivers that we have that affect nature, that affects how nature is to us in terms of ecosystem services and how that life. And the important is this bit in the middle. This do something about. So our actions, knowledge, and infrastructure, our social systems, ecology, culture, global trade, all of these things influence distributions of nature. And these are the things. Now I say I had to step very far out of my comfort zone as an ecologist and say, how on earth do we change socio-political and economic systems to preserve nature? But it's exactly that stepping outside of our comfort zone, talking about price elasticities and other things with people, and having the confidence to say, actually, I think you don't know what we're talking about, is what we need to really address nature and the conservation of nature. Because, of course, nature has huge range of values. So it has an intrinsic value, it has a value in and of itself, but it also, the political and the commercial sphere has really latched onto the idea that nature has this direct value to humans in terms of contribution to people. So there's ecosystem services. So the food and fibers we get from crops, timbers, clean water, clean air, climate regulation, soil formation and maintenance, pollination, natural enemies, flood protection. There's a huge range of benefits that we, as individuals and society, get from nature. And then there are also the other things that are slightly more difficult to measure. The relational values, the value that the relationship between nature and humans that has to us, including cultural values. And recognizing all of these different values of nature to people is important, even if we can't quantify and measure all of them. But if we ignore all of these different values that nature has to society, if we ignore them in decision making, then we risk making decisions that damage nature. And that's exactly what's happened. So we know that nature, in the broader sense, is in a fairly perilous state and a critical point. And this figure illustrates the planetary boundaries concept. So this is a concept that set of 9 environmental limits, if you like, within which humanity could continue to survive and thrive into the future for generations to come. So this kind of safe operating space. And this concept was developed in 2009, but last year in 2023 was the first time that the quantifications were made of where we were in terms of these limits. And you've probably realized what I'm going to say at this point is that we have exceeded 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. So these safe operating spaces, the limits within which the environment can continue to support humanity. We've exceeded 6 out of 9. We know that climate change in history or prehistory have ever lived through before. In terms of biosphere, up here, you know, it's biosphere integrity, genetic and functional. What does that mean? It's basically the workings of nature, so populations and ecosystems and flows of energy and production and consumption of resources are being they're being pushed beyond their limits for sustainability, for coping with the future. Bottom line is that the Earth is being pushed into a new system state, and the consequences, obviously, for humanity are fairly profound. These massive risks to nature, I suppose ecologists and environmental scientists have known about them for decades. But over the past few years, they've become increasingly recognized by other sectors of society. So every year, the World Economic Forum meets in Davos, they produce a risk report. And this year, the top 4 risks in the global risk report were related to climate change and biodiversity loss, exceeding these safe operating spaces for climate and biosphere integrity. So extreme weather events, critical change to Earth systems, biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, and natural resource shortages. So the question is, if ecologists and environmental scientists have known this for decades, and everyone else is just cottoning on, is this a spectacular failure of communication, or is it just a willful denial of the scale of the problem? Because the response requires massive change. Both of those scenarios seem fairly improbable, but that's where we are. And this situation is really what's motivated me, like I say, to get out of my comfort zone, get out of the usual silos that environmentalists and natural scientists used to work in, and to get the political and business world to recognize the problem and do something about it. And so the idea of using a natural capital approach to make nature and its value visible to audiences is something that I've been working on for the last 10 years or so. And the idea of this approach is to bring this conversation to audiences that aren't already talking about it. So the language of business and politics, using that to talk about nature in those languages. So to try and progress this natural capital approach, in 2012, I had to go back and I didn't realize it was quite so long ago actually. In 2012, Correction Daily, who's professor at Stanford, runs a natural capital project there at Trinity, and she was so inspiring to have our first national conference, Ireland's Natural Capital. We called it Ireland's Hidden Wealth, and it Gardens in 2014. And as an organisation was born, and we co-convened the first National Biodiversity Conference in 2019. Michael D. Higgins made his approach. We don't need to warn people about these problems. The signs are all very clearly there. And he said if we were miners, we'd be up to our knees in dead canaries. It was obvious that there's a problem. We need to do something about it. So this natural capital approach find out, can we apply a natural capital approach in Ireland? Can we value nature? Can we track changes in nature? And can we measure some of these things that are very difficult to measure? happily 10 years on from this first conference, which was 10 years ago next month, we've achieved a lot of what we set out to do. So the language of natural capital is in Irish policy, it's in business. A couple of weeks ago, we were at the NESC, the National Economic and Social Council discussion about the next steps of how we use this approach in Ireland. Last week, the CSO published their woodland or forest accounts, and rather than just reporting tons of timber that has been produced, they actually reported things like the amount of dead wood, the amount of carbon that was stored in timber products. And so this is a movement towards using this approach in measuring nature and the value of nature. The approach that we piloted, ecosystem accounting, has since become a UN standard for countries to report on non-financial accounts, and it's also very closely aligned with the non-financial reporting that corporates are required now to do through European directives. So there's been a huge amount of progress. It's still controversial. Still, when we talk about capital, people think primarily of financial capital, but the ecosystem accounting approach does allow us to use other metrics as well, and biophysical metrics and proxies for things like cultural values. And what we always say is it's not about putting a price on nature, it's about properly valuing it. And it's not possible to measure and account for everything, but putting a name on it, calling it out as having a value, and recognizing that it's there and reporting on it means that it's starting to take. And while most of the world has slowly got its head around about how to measure carbon as a really important contributor to climate change, we're not actually as advanced when it comes to straightforward and simple metrics for biodiversity, because biodiversity is complicated. But I am happily involved in some great projects using technology and AI to digitize biodiversity. So here's a sound recorder. I'm very aware that Anthony's in the audience. If I say anything wrong, just so what Anthony is doing is using, so this records the sounds of animals, of bats and birds, and then uses AI to generate visualizations for those sounds to be able to identify known species. So this can be used for remote monitoring, and in this case, it's for remote monitoring on wind farms. Did I get that more or less right, Anthony? Right. In another project, we're working with the engineers here with this brilliant thing, distinguish between different species of insect. And again, this is a system that could be used for remote monitoring in this case, pollinators. It can recognize different species of bumblebees. It's just amazing. And in other projects, so working with we're trying to figure out how to use remote sense data down at the farm scale to really measure what is there on farms in terms of nature. How much nature is there? What kind of state is it in? What ecosystem services is it providing? So that we can help inform management decisions, help to inform rewards for farmers, payments for ecosystem services. So this whole area of how do we measure and assess biodiversity, how do we reward good behavior and penalize bad behavior is something that's a massive current issue. Many organizations are talking now about restoration of biodiversity, biodiversity net gain, becoming nature positive. And this is a real challenge. It's a challenge in terms of measuring and accounting for nature. But this is something that we're working on by Orbit that Sylvia mentioned at the beginning. And we've got some excellent new projects with colleagues here from Trinity Business School. But getting societal, business, policy and economic change isn't all about regulations, reporting and rewards. It's also about people. It's about connecting with nature, and it's about winning hearts and minds. And this is where I come back again to the pollinators, because we've had success using pollinators as a flagship. And this is what Sylvia mentioned. Can't go anywhere else. And I still get total buzz. These signs everywhere. Zuna Fitzpatrick here, she's a scholar. She's an amazing and very inspirational lady. Una and I sat down in 2009 and said, we have to do something. We have to do something about pollinators and pollination loss. Of course, for all of you who remember 2009, nobody was interested in looking after nature. Everybody was interested in putting the economy back together. So there was very little interest. We bid our time, and in 2014 we put together a multi-stakeholder steering group, and in 2015 we launched the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. And it's really had an overwhelmingly positive response, and now nearly 10 years on, 100% of local authorities, councils on the island of Ireland have signed up and agreed to take action under the Pollinator Plan. More than 200 local communities have joined the private there's more than 4,000 sites across the island logged in the system as managed for pollinators. Every single primary school has received, collaboration super value, every single primary school has received materials and resources on pollinators. There's more than 300 businesses that have signed up to support the plan and are reporting on action. And they are actually taking action across more than 1,000 different business sites. It's inspired other European member states, council, and pollinators have become this flagship. They've become something that people can embrace, but also something that's very high on the international conservation targets. So the global biodiversity framework targets, the EU biodiversity strategy, both call out restoration and conservation of pollinators. And these successful conservation initiatives need an evidence base, and that's where we come in, the scientific research that determines what works and what doesn't and where you should take action. There's no point wasting time and money on actions that are inappropriate, and this is where our research comes in to inform these things. So understanding, what but actually everyone's buying bee hotels, so do they work? What kind of agricultural management benefits pollinators, what kinds of insects are using different kinds of resources, and then we can tailor guidelines specific and to communities, to businesses, and also to influence policy to make sure that public money isn't being wasted. And people love it. So from back in the days in the late 90s when I started working on bees and everyone thought we were a bit mad, there's much more appreciation now for the importance of pollinators and the fact that we need to do something, and people love bees. And it's strange and slightly uncomfortable for a scientist to get emotional and to talk about love. Well, we probably do need to talk a little bit more about nature in order to look after it. And some people have suggested that only by caring about nature and caring about the earth as if it was a friend or a family member that we're in poor health, only then will we actually start to do something about it. So in terms of loving nature and getting connected with nature, this is a really important part of what we're doing. As I say, not all about regulation, reporting. We really do need people, we need hearts and minds. Organizations, governments, they are all made up of people to start to love nature. So I realized when I put this talk together, I was clear, we need take-home messages. I'm such an academic. And I actually wrote them down at the end. Apologies about this, my take-home messages. Actually, it's not all about bees. It might seem like it's all about bees. They are pretty cool. They're very important ecologically and economically and for engagement. But of course, bees are just a flagship. They're just something people can identify with, and people prefer bees to flies, for example. But diversity is absolutely crucial. So complexity and diversity, the diversity of creatures that are flying around or that live in the soil, their interactions, they keep us going. So that keeps us, enables us to breathe, to eat, to drink. They recycle waste, they store carbon, they're filtering water, they're keeping us fit physically and mentally. And diversity across our landscape is so important for maintaining that diversity in ecosystems. So we need to value nature. As I say, it's not about putting a price on it, but valuing it properly as our life support. support system. And we need more people who appreciate nature, embrace its complexity, variability, and at times unpredictability. So more ecologists, please. But we also need people who really love nature and really want to restore it. So I just want to thank at the end a huge number of colleagues, collaborators, co-authors, students, interns, postdocs, friends, a small proportion of whom are shown here. And when I look at these pictures of the people that have made all of this work possible over the last 20 odd years, there's a lot of pride, but overwhelmingly, there's a lot of happiness. And if I look at these pictures, there's a lot of smiles. Through all the traumas of grant proposals and manuscripts and PhD theses, of births, deaths and marriages, there's a lot of love here. And it's been a privilege to work with all of these people. And so whilst I'm always saying that we need to love nature in order to be compelled to actually want to look after it, we also have to love our jobs. And we do have to work well with the people that we're fortunate enough to work with. So I just want to finish tonight by dedicating these two wonderful ecologists, colleagues and friends, both of whom had incredible love for nature. They were loved by very many of us, especially in botany and zoology here in Trinity. And their memories spur me on to keep going and keep doing this work. So thank you very much.
It's really all about Jane today, and we've had a real exposure to what's important to Jane, what's important to us, and also what's important for the future and the next generations. And I think Jane is a real inspiration. So thank you all so very much for coming. I know that if you have any questions, as in what plant should I put in my garden, you need to ask Jane at the reception. And I just want to reiterate thanks to everybody that's organised the event, Katie and hi Andrew, and especially just one last round of applause for Jane.